This 1910 portrait of two factory sisters looks sweet until you notice the bandages. This 1910 portrait of two factory sisters looks sweet until you notice the bandages. At first glance, it seemed like any other keepsake photograph from a New England mill town. Two teenage girls, shoulder to shoulder, seated in what appears to be a breakroom or lunchtime gathering space. Their faces are serious, but not unhappy. Their clothes are plain cotton, worn soft. Behind them, the blurred outline of other workers drifts out of focus. It could be a portrait of sisterhood, of family pride, of immigrant success in a new country, until one detail began to pull at the edges of everything else. Margaret Ouellet noticed it on a Thursday afternoon in November 2019 in the climate-controlled basement of the Manchester Historic Association in New Hampshire. She had been working as a photograph conservator for nearly 2 decades, mostly with institutional collections from the region's industrial past. In her time, she had handled thousands of images, from daguerreotypes of mill executives to Lewis Hines' famous investigations into child labor. She thought she had seen everything that early 20th century factory photography could offer. She was wrong. The photograph had arrived as part of a larger donation, a collection of ephemera from a family estate sale in the west side of Manchester, old receipts, church bulletins, a bundle of letters in French, and tucked between 2 pieces of cardboard, this single image, roughly 4 inches by 6 inches, printed on thick paper stock. No studio name stamped on the reverse, just a date written in faded pencil, May 1910. Margaret placed it under her magnifying lamp and began her standard assessment. Paper condition, fair, some foxing at the edges, emulsion, stable. Image sharpness, excellent for the era. The 2 girls in the frame were perhaps 14 and 16 years old, with the same dark hair and the same heavy-lidded eyes. Sisters, almost certainly. The older one wore a high-collared blouse buttoned to her throat. The younger one had her sleeves rolled to the elbow. And there it was. Both girls held their hands in their laps, fingers loosely interlaced, as if posing for a confirmation portrait. But across every fingertip, wrapped in identical thin strips of white cloth, were bandages. Not a single finger escaped them. The wrappings were precise, methodical, layered in a way that suggested not home remedy but practiced routine. They covered the pads and tips of all 10 fingers on each girl, from thumb to pinky. Margaret leaned closer. The image resolution was good enough to make out fine creases in the bandages, a slight discoloration at the edges where fabric met skin. Whatever had happened to these girls' hands had happened to all of them, at the same time, in the same way. She set the photograph down and felt the silence of the archive around her. This was not a portrait of sisterhood. This was something else. Margaret's career had taken her through collections large and small, from the Smithsonian to regional historical societies that operated out of converted church basements. She had a reputation for patience and precision, for the kind of methodical attention that could reconstruct a photograph's entire provenance from a single studio watermark. She was not easily rattled, but something about these 2 girls, their steady gaze, their matched injuries, the way they held their hands in plain view as if the bandages were unremarkable, made her feel the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet. She returned to her workbench and pulled out her documentation kit. She photographed the image under different light sources, front and back. She recorded the paper stock, the print process, the dimensions. She examined the penciled date under ultraviolet light. May 1910. The handwriting was consistent with early 20th century script, with the backward sloping letters common to French-Canadian cursive. Then she turned the photograph over again and noticed something she had missed. In the lower right corner, partially obscured by a piece of old tape, was a second line of writing. She lifted the tape with surgical care. Beneath it, in the same faded hand, were 2 names: Marie-Thérèse Gagnon, age 14, Adèle Gagnon, age 16. And below the names, a single word that stopped her cold: bonus. Margaret stared at the word for a long time. She had worked with enough industrial photography to know what it might mean, but she needed to be sure. The next morning, she called Dr. Eleanor Vance, a labor historian at the University of New Hampshire, who specialized in New England textile manufacturing. Eleanor had written extensively on the Amiskag Manufacturing Company, which had once been the largest cotton textile operation in the world, sprawling across the banks of the Merrimack River in Manchester, with 17,000 workers and dozens of buildings producing cloth at the rate of 50 miles per hour. By the 1910s, more than a third of those workers were French-Canadian immigrants who had crossed the border from Quebec in search of wages they could not find on failing farms. They were paid by the piece, not by the hour. Speed was money, and speed, as Eleanor explained when Margaret showed her the photograph, had a cost. Eleanor studied the image through her reading glasses. Her face changed as she looked. She said nothing for several minutes. Then she asked Margaret if she knew what a piecer was. In a cotton mill, the spinning room was the domain of the piece rate worker. Cotton fibers, drawn from raw bales, were twisted into thread by massive spinning frames that ran the length of entire floors. When threads broke, which they did constantly, someone had to tie them back together before the whole operation snarled. That someone was usually a woman or a girl. She moved along the row of spindles, fingers flying, knotting and splicing the broken strands as fast as she could. The faster she worked, the more she earned. The more she earned, the less likely her family would fall behind on rent. But the cotton fibers were coarse and the threads were abrasive. After hours of constant contact, the fingertips split open. The skin cracked and bled. Workers wrapped them in rags or strips of cloth to dull the pain and keep working. The bandages were not evidence of a single accident. They were evidence of a system. Eleanor pointed to the word written on the back of the photograph. Bonus. In some mills, she said, there were speed incentives. If a worker exceeded her quota, she received a small bonus payment. The faster you tied, the more you made. But the quotas were calibrated to be just out of reach at a safe pace. To hit them, workers had to push their bodies past the point of breakdown. Fingers bled, joints swelled, lungs filled with cotton dust. The injuries were not incidental. They were designed into the system. Margaret asked if there would be records. Eleanor said that was the problem. Mill companies in the early 20th century were not required to keep detailed injury logs the way modern employers are. Some did for their own internal purposes, but those records were often incomplete, inconsistent, or entirely missing. And in mills where supervisors had financial incentives tied to output, there was pressure to underreport accidents. A logged injury meant a possible inspection. An inspection meant possible fines. A fine meant the supervisor's bonus disappeared. So the injuries disappeared first. On paper, at least. If Margaret wanted to understand what happened to Marie-Thérèse and Adèle Gagnon, she would need to find another way in. Margaret began with the obvious: census records, city directories, church registries. By 1910, French Canadians made up nearly 40% of Manchester's population, concentrated on the city's west side in densely packed tenements built to house the mill workforce. They attended French-speaking Catholic parishes, sent their children to French-language parochial schools, and maintained a fierce cultural identity even as they assimilated into the rhythms of American industry. Their names filled the employment rolls of the Amiskag mills. She found the Gagnon family in the 1910 census. Father, Joseph Gagnon, cotton mill worker, age 42. Mother, Selina Gagnon, no occupation listed, age 39. Children, Adèle, 16, cotton mill worker. Marie-Thérèse, 14, cotton mill worker. Louis, 12, school. Henriette, 9, school. Albert, 6, at home. Rose Marie, 3, at home. Infant, male, unnamed, deceased. The family lived on Cartier Street in the heart of Little Canada, Manchester's French-speaking quarter. The tenement buildings there were notorious for overcrowding. In some, families lived 10 to a room. Typhoid and diphtheria swept through with grim regularity. An investigation in Brunswick, Maine, a similar mill town, had found French-Canadian children dying at appalling rates in housing where outhouses overflowed into basement wells. The conditions in Manchester were not much better. Margaret noted the deceased infant. It was not uncommon. Infant mortality in mill districts ran higher than anywhere else in the region, but she flagged it anyway. Death, she had learned, often pointed toward larger patterns. She turned next to parish records. The Gagnons attended Sainte Marie Church, the largest French-Canadian parish in Manchester, a grand brick structure on the west side that had served as the spiritual and social center of the immigrant community since the 1880s. The church kept meticulous baptismal, marriage, and burial records, all in French, all bound in heavy leather volumes. Margaret found Marie-Thérèse Gagnon's baptism in 1896, Adèle's in 1894. The deceased infant, named Jean-Baptiste, had been baptized in February 1909 and buried 3 weeks later. Cause of death was listed as failure to thrive, a catch-all diagnosis that could mean anything from malnutrition to congenital defect to simple neglect. But it was another entry that caught her attention. In June 1911, a year after the photograph was taken, Marie-Thérèse Gagnon was listed in the parish burial records. She was 15 years old. Cause of death, blood poisoning. Margaret stared at the page. Blood poisoning, septicemia, an infection that spread through the bloodstream, usually from an untreated wound. In 1911, there were no antibiotics. A cut that festered could kill within days. She thought of the bandaged fingers in the photograph. She thought of the word bonus. The system was beginning to come into focus. Margaret reached out to Dr. Paul Lefebvre, a medical historian at Dartmouth who had studied occupational illness in New England's industrial era. She sent him the photograph, the census data, the burial record. He called her back within an hour. He told her about the hands. In textile mills, he explained, finger injuries were endemic. The constant friction from tying broken threads wore through the skin faster than it could heal. Workers developed deep cracks, open sores, and chronic infections. The lint and dust in the air infiltrated every wound. Mills were kept hot and humid to prevent thread breakage, which meant bacteria thrived. A blister could become an abscess could become gangrene. The company physicians, when they existed at all, were paid by the mill, not the workers. Their job was to keep production moving. A girl with bleeding fingers might receive a quick rap and be sent back to her station. If she complained, she risked losing her position. If she lost her position, her family lost her wages. And in a household where every dollar mattered, lost wages could mean eviction. Paul had seen similar cases in his research. Girls who died of infections that started in their hands. Women who lost fingers to machines and continued working the next day. Children whose stunted growth and respiratory diseases were documented by reform photographers but ignored by the companies that employed them. He asked Margaret if she had found any employment records for the Gagnon sisters. She had not. The Amoscag records from that era were incomplete, many destroyed in floods, fires, and deliberate purges during the company's long decline toward bankruptcy in 1935. But there might be another source. In 1908, the National Child Labor Committee had hired a photographer named Louis Hine to document working conditions in American factories. Hine spent years traveling to mills across New England and the South, photographing children at their stations, recording their ages and heights, sometimes tricking his way past factory guards by posing as a fire inspector or Bible salesman. His photographs from Manchester, taken in May 1909, were among the most damning in his collection. They showed children as young as 11 working the spinning frames, their faces blank with exhaustion. Paul suggested Margaret contact the Library of Congress, which held over 5,000 of Hine's original prints and negatives. Perhaps there was more documentation. Perhaps there were field notes, interview transcripts, something that could illuminate what was happening to workers like the Gagnon sisters. Margaret made the call. 3 weeks later, a research assistant at the Library of Congress sent her a digital scan of a document she had never seen before. It was a handwritten page from Hine's field notes, dated May 1909, describing his visit to one of the Amoscag spinning rooms. Most of the notes were fragmentary, observations about lighting conditions and camera angles. But near the bottom of the page, Hine had recorded a conversation with a floor supervisor, a man he identified only as Mr. B. The supervisor had boasted about his speed bonus system. Hine wrote that Mr. B explained how girls who exceeded their quota by 20% received an extra nickel per day. But to hit that number, they had to work without stopping, without resting their hands, without pausing when the skin split. Hine had noted, in parentheses, many girls would bandaged fingers. Supervisor says it is just part of the work. Margaret read the sentence 3 times, then she looked at the photograph of Marie-Thérèse and Adèle Gagnon. Just part of the work. She called Eleanor Vance again. She told her what she had found. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that changed everything. She said the injury logs might not have been destroyed. They might have been hidden. Eleanor explained that in 1912, the year after Marie-Thérèse Gagnon died, the state of New Hampshire had conducted an investigation into working conditions at the Amoskeag Mills. The investigation was prompted by labor unrest, by newspaper reports of child injuries, and by pressure from progressive reformers who had been galvanized by the infamous Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, just across the state border. Manchester mill owners, fearing similar upheaval, had quietly agreed to participate in a state inquiry, but only on the condition that certain records be sealed. Those records, Eleanor believed, were still held in a restricted archive at the New Hampshire State Library in Concord. They included internal company memoranda, accident reports, and testimony from workers that had never been made public. If Margaret wanted to understand what really happened to Marie-Thérèse Gagnon, the answer might be there. Getting access to a restricted archive is not like checking out a library book. It requires institutional affiliation, a stated research purpose, and approval from an oversight committee that meets, in this case, only quarterly. Margaret submitted her request in January. She received approval in April. By late May 2020, she was seated in a climate-controlled reading room in Concord, surrounded by boxes of documents that had not been touched in decades. The 1912 investigation had been more extensive than she expected. Inspectors had visited multiple mill buildings, interviewed dozens of workers, and compiled detailed reports on everything from ventilation to toilet facilities. But the most damning material was in a subfolder labeled Accident Records Withheld. Inside were internal company reports that had been submitted during the investigation, but never entered into the public record. They showed patterns of injury that the official logs had systematically obscured. Workers who lost fingers were recorded as having resigned for personal reasons. Girls who contracted infections were listed as transferred to other departments. Deaths from occupational causes were attributed to pre-existing conditions. And there, in a bundle of handwritten memoranda from the spinning room supervisors, Margaret found a name she recognized. A memo dated March 1911, 2 months before Marie-Thérèse Gagnon died, described a dispute over bonus payments. The supervisor, identified as Bertrand Morin, had complained that several workers were falling short of their quotas because they were spending too much time tending to hand injuries. He recommended that injured workers be reassigned to lower-paying positions or, if they refused, dismissed. He noted that one worker, M.T. Gagnon, had been warned twice. A second memo dated May 1911 reported that M.T. Gagnon had been sent home after showing signs of fever and swelling in her left hand. The memo noted that she had not returned to work. No further action was listed. Margaret checked the burial record again. Marie-Thérèse Gagnon had died on June 3, 1911. The cause was blood poisoning. She was 15 years old. The infection had started in her hands. The hands had been injured by work. The work had been structured to cause injury. And when she could no longer produce at the required pace, she'd been sent home to die. Margaret closed the folder. She sat alone in the reading room for a long time. When she returned to Manchester, Margaret brought her findings to the museum's director, a man named Richard Fortier. She proposed a small exhibition: the photograph, the census records, the burial entry, the sealed memos. A story about 2 sisters, 1 system, and the cost of silence. Richard listened carefully. Then he explained why it would be complicated. The Manchester Historic Association received significant funding from donors whose families had been connected to the mill industry for generations. Some of those families still carried names that appeared in the 1912 investigation. An exhibition that portrayed the mills as engines of exploitation, that named supervisors and implicated company policy, could upset relationships that the museum depended on. Richard did not say no. He said, "Let me think about it." 2 weeks later, Margaret was invited to a meeting of the museum's board of directors. The room was polished mahogany and oil portraits, the faces of Manchester's industrial founders gazing down from gilded frames. She presented her research in careful, measured terms. She showed the photograph. She read aloud from the sealed memos. She described what blood poisoning does to a 15-year-old body. The board members were not indifferent. Several expressed genuine distress. But when the discussion turned to action, the same concerns emerged: interpretation versus fact, context versus accusation, the danger of alienating the community the museum was meant to serve. One board member, a retired executive whose great-grandfather had been an Amos Keg overseer, suggested that the photograph could be displayed without the memos. "Let people draw their own conclusions," he said. "We don't have to editorialize." Margaret asked what conclusion they would draw without knowing that Marie-Thérèse Gagnon died because her wounded fingers were never treated, without knowing that her supervisor had recommended her dismissal for falling behind, without knowing that the injury logs had been hidden to protect the company's reputation. The room was silent. Another board member, a younger woman who taught at the local community college, spoke up. She said that the museum's mission was to tell the truth about Manchester's past. If they only told the comfortable parts, they were not doing their job. The workers who had built this city, many of them immigrants, many of them children, deserved to have their stories told accurately. Their descendants deserved to know what their families had endured. The debate continued for over an hour. In the end, the board voted to proceed with a modified version of the exhibition. The photograph would be displayed alongside contextual information about working conditions in the mills. The sealed memos would be referenced but not reproduced in full. And the museum would host a community forum where descendants of mill workers could share their own family stories. It was a compromise. It was not everything Margaret had hoped for, but it was a beginning. The exhibition opened in September 2021. It was small, occupying a single room in the museum's lower level. The photograph of Marie-Thérèse and Adèle Gagnon hung at the center, enlarged and printed on archival paper. Beside it, a panel explained the piece rate system, the speed bonuses, the chronic injuries that workers endured. Another panel described the 1912 investigation and the records that had been sealed. At the community forum, over 100 people attended. Many were descendants of French-Canadian mill workers. They brought their own photographs, their own stories, their own memories of grandparents who had worked the spinning frames. One elderly woman, whose grandmother had been a piecer in the 1920s, held up her grandmother's hands in a photograph. The fingers were gnarled and scarred, bent at odd angles. She said her grandmother had never been able to sew a button or hold a pen properly after her years in the mill. Another man described finding his great-aunt's name in a company ledger. She had been recorded as voluntarily resigned in 1915, but his family's oral history told a different story. She had been fired after refusing to work through a hand infection. She had died at home 2 months later, at the age of 17. Story after story emerged. The sealed records, it seemed, had hidden more than the museum could contain. Adèle Gagnon, the older sister in the photograph, survived. Margaret found her in the 1920 census, married to a man named Dufresne, living on the west side of Manchester, employed not in the mills but as a seamstress in a small dress shop. She had 2 children by then. She lived until 1967. Her obituary, published in L'Avenir National, made no mention of her years in the spinning room. But Margaret found another source. In the 1970s, a graduate student at the University of New Hampshire had conducted oral history interviews with elderly Franco-Americans who had worked in the mills or whose parents had. One of the interviews was with a woman named Lucienne Dufresne Roy, Adèle's daughter. Lucienne had been asked about her mother's experience in the mills. She said her mother rarely spoke of it, but once, when Lucienne was a teenager, she had asked about the scars on her mother's fingertips. Adèle had looked at her hands for a long time. Then, she had said something Lucienne never forgot. She said, "We all had those scars, the ones who lived." Margaret listened to the recording in the archive's listening room. The tape hissed and crackled. Lucienne's voice was thin with age, but the words were clear. We all had those scars, the ones who lived. Marie-Thérèse Gagnon did not live. She was 15 years old when an infection in her fingers spread to her blood and killed her. Her death was recorded in a parish ledger and filed in a company memo and then forgotten for over a century. The photograph of her and her sister, taken a year before she died, preserved her face, but not her story. Until now. The portrait still hangs in the Manchester Historic Association. Visitors pause in front of Oz. Sometimes for a long time. They look at the two girls, their serious faces, their matched bandages. They read the panels beside it. They learn about the piece rate system, the speed bonuses, the chronic injuries, the sealed records. They learn that one of the girls in the photograph died at 15. Most visitors leave quietly. Some cry, some take photographs with their phones, some stand in silence, as if listening for something. Margaret still works at the museum. She still handles photographs from the industrial era, but she says her approach has changed. She looks differently at the hands now. She notices things she might have missed before: a crooked finger, a missing nail, a bandage that should not be there. Every old photograph, she says, is evidence of something. The question is whether we are willing to see it. For decades, the official story of Manchester's mills was one of progress and prosperity, of immigrant families lifting themselves into the middle class through honest work. And that story was partly true, but it was also incomplete. It left out the children who died, the injuries that were hidden, the records that were sealed. The photograph of Marie-Thérèse and Adèle Gagnon does not show a tragedy. It shows ordinary life. Two sisters sitting for a portrait, their hands in their laps, their fingers wrapped in bandages that were just part of the work. The tragedy is that no one was supposed to ask why. Now we know. The bandages were not evidence of accident. They were evidence of system. A system that paid by the piece and punished by the body. A system that kept girls at their stations until their skin cracked and their blood ran and their wounds festered and sometimes killed them. A system that recorded their deaths as personal misfortune and buried the truth in sealed archives. Marie-Thérèse Gagnon was 15 years old. Her fingers were wrapped in bandages. She died of blood poisoning in June 1911. Her name appears in a memo recommending her dismissal for falling behind. She was not the only one. In archives across New England, in parish records and company ledgers and family photographs, there are thousands of names like hers: girls who worked the spinning frames, boys who hauled coal, children who entered the mills at 10 and left at 60, if they left at all. Their hands tell the story. Their silence tells another. The next time you see an old photograph, look at the hands, look at the fingers, look for the bandages, the scars, the missing joints. Ask what the image is trying to hide. Sometimes the answer is just part of the work, and sometimes the work was death.